가까이에서도 멀리에서도 우리 삶의 순간마다 우러르는 깃발이다.
I saw my friend's mother publicly executed her crime watching a Hollywood movie. My father died in China after we escaped North Korea. And I had to bury him at 3 a.m. in Sequoia. I was 14 years old. I couldn't even cry. I was afraid to be sent back to North Korea. We were prepared to kill ourselves if we were going to be sent back to North Korea.
Not many of us grow up under a communist tyranny, and those who do rarely manage to escape it. The refugees that do tell us harrowing stories of famine, death, and misery. A lesson to the free world about the importance of its values. One of the few countries of this kind left on Earth is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or as we know it, North Korea, which is constantly being exposed by the stories of people who fled its territory. We don't know everything about what is going on behind the secretive borders of the Hermit Kingdom, but what we do hear from escapees is absolutely heartbreaking. Accounts of unimaginable hardship under the boot of an uncaring government that never lets anyone leave. People being left malnourished, so they can't resist. Millions being sent away to isolated prison camps. Accounts of these happenings convince much of the world that North Korea is a rogue state, one that cannot be trusted and must be kept isolated, in the hope that its people will eventually rise up and depose the regime. But what if the things we think we know about this country and its way of life don't hold up to scrutiny at all? Are defector accounts always truthful? Are there any questions we could raise or doubts we could have? Surely no one would lie about experiencing hell on Earth, right? Well, the best thing we can do is listen to what these defectors have to say and judge for ourselves. Welcome to Mega. One of the most fascinating people on the roster of outspoken defectors is Park Yeonmi, an activist who frequently speaks out about life in North Korea and champions causes opposing its government. She has made many appearances on television and social media, spoken at numerous talks about human rights, and is a published author. Yeonmi was born in 1993, right as the DPRK was hit with the terrible famine, which went on to be known within the country as the Arduous March. She is the daughter of Byung Kum-suk and Park Jin-shi, and grew up in the border town of Hyesan near China, together with her big sister Park Eun-mi. According to her book In Order to Live, much of her early life was characterized by a state of absolute poverty, her parents resorting to desperate measures to keep the family fed. It was often necessary to cuddle in front of the fireplace just to keep warm on cold nights due to lacking electricity, and even death was no stranger. People were dying all the time due to starvation. As food rations from the state became scarce, many North Korean families were forced to think outside the box for support, buying food and selling other goods independently to make ends meet. Park Jin-shi began trading in Chinese cigarettes and other forms of contraband in order to live, a practice initially deeply frowned upon under the DPRK's planned, directed communist system. According to Yeonmi, visits to the black market occurred often, and she even was involved in illegal activities from time to time too. But as more open markets sprouted up with the knowledge and acceptance of the North's government, more citizens of Hyesan began excelling in forms of legal bartering, and Park Jin-shi sold products of greater and greater value. To keep up the worth of his trade, he began selling smuggled metals, such as copper, silver, and even gold, to complement the rest of his stock. The North Korean government was none the wiser. But eventually this illegal trading caught up with him, and Park Jin-shi was arrested, sent away to serve a long prison sentence. This led to various periods during which the Park sisters needed to fend for themselves with the intermittent support of their mother. Yeonmi claimed to have endured terrible periods of hunger, needing to catch grasshoppers and dragonflies and eat various plant life in order to survive. According to the book, when Byung-Kum-soo was arrested and sent to a labor camp, Yeonmi and Eunmi were dropped off at their uncle's place. Byung-Kum-soo was eventually released, and Park Shin-shi got his 17-year sentence temporarily suspended due to illness, reuniting the family. Realizing how desperate their situation was, the Parks secretly began plotting their escape. Yeonmi was recovering at the hospital from an appendectomy when Eunmi left for China on her own without the knowledge of the others. This prompted Yeonmi and her mother to follow in Eunmi's footsteps to China, fleeing the DPRK with the help of Chinese brokers. As it was stated in the book, she begged me, "Just give me one chance to tell your father that I'm going, then I'll come back." I wouldn't let her leave, not even to tell my father. He would find a way to stop her, or she would change her mind. I knew if I let her out of my sight, I would never see her again. So I said everything I could to persuade her to go with me now. I told her that we would find Eunmi and could settle in China first, and then we would get father to come later. Page 120, In Order to Live. So, as we can read, Yeonmi and her mother were so desperate they decided to leave Park Shin-shi behind to escape on his own. Through luck or determination, the family actually reunited in China. But sadly, Park Shin-shi succumbed to cancer and passed away. He was then buried in secret by his family to prevent the body being discovered by the Chinese authorities. From China, Yeonmi and her mother were able to pass through to Mongolia, and from there to South Korea, and later to the United States, where they live now.
Basically, 2007, I left North Korea with my mom and my father.
Wait, what did she just say?
I left North Korea with my mom and my father. I went to China with my family, so my mom, my father.
Yeonmi and her parents walked across the mountains to the border.
Yes, I crossed to China, so I escaped my mom and my father, three of us.
So, which one of the stories is true? In reading an article from The Diplomat written by journalist Mary Ann Jolly titled The Strange Tale of Yeonmi Park, we can see Yeonmi elaborated in an interview that she, together with both her parents, defected from the DPRK with the use of cars belonging to Chinese contacts her father established through his years of illegal trade. Interestingly enough, Yeonmi responded to this article and made various corrections surrounding her claims, but notably did not change her statements on two key facts that appeared in the article: that she left with both her parents and that they were picked up by cars. This does not add up with most other accounts of the escape she has made, where, as we read previously, she described leaving her father behind and traveling on foot across the frozen Yalu River to reach the Chinese border. Despite this narrative not matching with the stories she told to various other journalists, she did not point it out as miscommunication or misreporting in her response. A common justification for the discrepancies in Yeonmi's stories is a language barrier or a murky childhood memory. She initially claimed to have climbed over mountains to reach China and had to eat grass to survive during the famine. But after these claims were questioned, she later stated that grass and plants and Korean use very similar words, as do mountain and hill, which can explain some strange details. However, I think it is unreasonable to believe that two drastically different versions of the Park family's escape story are up to not speaking English properly, and I doubt that you can cast two completely different fates for her father as simply misremembering, even from someone at a young age. How do you say we left my dad behind again in Korean? Was it anything like, I left with both my parents to China? Additionally, Yeonmi's book, which she has claimed to be the entirely true account of her story, still makes references to mountains despite this language barrier clarification. It also includes accounts from Yeonmi about witnessing public executions in Hyesan City, even though she claimed in her response to the Diplomat article, which also included anecdotes to execution stories, that I never saw any executions in Hyesan City. And any implication to the contrary
was due to miscommunication. Remember, this article and the response were written before this book was finished.
In an interview with SBS Dateline, the same interview where the discrepancies over her father leaving or staying came to light, it is mentioned that Yeonmi and her father crossed into China through the Tumen River.
Her sister, Yeonmi, and her parents walked across the mountains to the border, where they bribed guards to cross the Tumen River to China. But there was no sign of Yeonmi.
While in her book, the very first sentence describes them as crossing through the Yalu River, two different rivers straddling across two different sides of the North Korean border. Do these rivers have similar names in Korean too? Even more notably, the DPRK analysis site 38 North claimed in an article before the book's publication that other advocate defectors believed Park was telling the stories of other refugees to use in her own account. These alleged defectors were not named, so this info is to take with a big grain of salt. Yet the allegations of plagiarism, coupled with multiple examples of blatant inconsistencies, are hard to ignore. Some defenders of Yeonmi have made the case that her inaccuracies should not diminish her trustworthiness in the eyes of others, and that it is unfair to question these discrepancies as muddled memories can be caused by trauma. While it is obviously reasonable to imagine that a trauma survivor could not give you a perfectly accurate point-by-point timeline of their experiences, especially on a first attempt, that dates or orders or events could be mixed up. Yeonmi has a track record of telling key segments of her story differently across a period of not days, weeks, or months, but years, far from a one-time occurrence or an understandable slip-up.
Ultimately, if you want to be an outspoken activist and base that activism on your personal life story, you should be able to tell your own story with consistency and honesty, as it is inevitable that your activism will be undermined if that story later shows up to be filled with gaps, irreconcilable differences, or unanswerable questions. Something we can especially see by the fact that the DPRK has capitalized on Yeonmi's inconsistencies in its own state media documentaries.
Let's see one by one the ridiculous lies told by Park Yeonmi. To begin with, her escape story itself is absolutely absurd. She said she climbed 3 or even 4 mountains during the night to get to the border from Haesan. But from Haesan in Gyeongbuk province, where she was born and lived before fleeing the country, there is no mountain to climb in order to reach the border. All she needs is to cross a river which is so near from Haesan. Her inconsistencies in the testimony about her father enhance the absurdity and poorness of Park Yeonmi's script.
These sorts of problems are in a way a reminder of a story, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. If you tell lies over and over again, then eventually, when you come forward and say, "Now I'm offering you the full truth," can you really be surprised if that truth is seen as another misdirection? If your credibility as a trustworthy source has been lost. If the state you've made it your mission to call out uses your own claims against you.
Early last year, in an interview with a libertarian radio station in San Francisco, US, Park Yeonmi said she and her parents, 3 of them, had crossed a river to reach China, where her father's business partners were waiting for them with their cars. Then in the One Young World Summit held in Dublin, she said she and her mother, just 2 of them, had escaped. And then in another interview with Marianne Jolly, an Australian broadcast journalist, Park said she had buried her father at night all by herself. She told a different story to other journalists that her father's body had been cremated. In the Dublin One Young World Summit, she said she had buried her father alone at 3 a.m. After 3 months, in an interview with The New Focus, she said she had held her father's funeral with the brokers, and she had even asked a favor from one of the defectors called Kim Hee-won to support her statement. All the stories told by Park Yeonmi about her parents are lies.
The DPRK already is known in the public eye as a country shrouded in darkness. To create reporting that shines a light on it, there has to be a solid standard of truthfulness. A standard that North Korea-related journalism seems to badly lack, with its tendency to spread stories that appear out of seemingly nowhere, like wildfire, with little to no basis in truth. Speaking of shoddy reporting, now that we sprayed Yeonmi's story with bullets, it is time to look at another facet of her career. She pretends to be a journalist, just like how I pretend to be one. The big difference being that this report here is heavily backed up with sources. But surely, the shit Yeonmi comes out with can't be as bad as, I don't know, claiming that cannibalism is resurging in the DPRK based on watching a movie?
Where is her son? One of the neighbors, the child, he came into the kitchen and saw the, fingers of the child, and he reported to the police, and she got executed. And people eating dead bodies and go cook the human flesh. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Yeonmi Park, and I'm a North Korean defector human rights activist. Unspeakable thing about the starvation is that in the last minute of your starvation, you hallucinate, you are not in your same mind. And one of the movie that based on true story that hero made in South Korea was about a mother who had a son, and she was so hungry, so she was looking at a son and she thought that was rice and started eating, and then realizing that wasn't. And then later she sees her child, and then she thinks that's a dog. So he kills her child and cooks it. And then a few days later, she eats, or she gotten better from eating the meat. And then she's going around asking for her son. Where is her son?
So Yeonmi baits the viewer into her report on cannibalism in the DPRK and explains only halfway through the report that this description of cannibalism only took place in a movie. No sources are linked, all we get is anecdotes. Actually, no videos I have seen from her YouTube channel include any kind of sourcing linked whatsoever, always containing the same stock links to her social media and her book. By the way, Yeonmi, get rid of this error in your link listing, it's driving me crazy. And just in case you might assume this is just a one-time example of rookie journalism, a mistake that wouldn't be repeated again, there's another example of this bait and switch technique. At a first glance, this video seems to be all about what life is like for LGBT people in North Korea. Something that would seem like a rather interesting topic. How a socially conservative society responds to people with different sexualities and unconventional mindsets. But when you actually get into watching the video, it turns out to be all about TikToks, complaining about pronouns and people in American society, questioning their gender identity.
According to wikia.org, a demigirl, also called a demi-woman, demi-lady, or demi-female, is a gender identity describing someone who partially but not fully identifies as a woman or girl, whatever their assigned gender at birth. They may or may not identify as another gender in addition to feeling partially a girl or a woman. If you want to read the next bit, you can pause it now. I'll move out the way.
So, did you understand that?
I don't understand.
So
complicated.
And there are so far 58
Oh,
different genders.
are you serious?
Yeah,
Oh,
58 different genders.
The closest we get to hearing about North Korea is a series of anecdotes about the culture shock Yeonmi and her defector friend experienced when seeing these topics being brought up in the West for the first time. At no point does this video ever address its supposed topic. What happens to gay people in North Korea?
I didn't even not know the word gay. Did you know the word gay in North Korea?
I never heard of it. So there's a girl when I was in North Korea. She lived actually next to our home, like apartment building, and then she actually, I think she was a lesbian. But in North Korea, once you coming out, then you will be sent to some kind of a village, right? So,
but like we don't even know that. We don't know what that is.
That's why we don't have words to describe those people.
So as we can see, Yeonmi's supposedly informative videos are, to put it politely, economical with the truth. Just in case you think we're cherry-picking from the more ridiculous videos she likes to put out, here's a bunch more examples of the questionable things Yeonmi has to say on her channel.
Hi everyone! Welcome to my channel. I feel like I'm 90% sure at this point that Kim Jong-un is watching this channel when people don't have drugs, when children have a cold, parents give them crystal meth. Like, you take some, it's gonna make you feel better. 3 to 8 generations gets punished. So when there was one high-ranking official escaped, they killed more than 30,000 people because of one person's defection. Kim Jong-un's in the back of his head shows a huge tumor. And some North elites in South Korea have confirmed that train station somehow had a lot of dead bodies because North Korea is very cold. So one more time. So do you see he's squeezing his hands like as if he's like a lover. Here it would take like 1 hour to go the other place. In North it would take a month at least to go because there's no electricity. And sometimes people have to push the train.
They have to push the train?
Yeah. Yeah.
And for the last stop on this train of tall tales we've decided to ride on, how about we show one of the most dubious recent examples of these weird anecdotes Yeonmi presents to her audience. We looked at this video where she talks about a horrifying event where Kim Jong-un executed an orchestra conductor by shooting him 90 times in front of every artist in the capital city.
So the news that I got in recent days is that it's just heartbreaking. Kim Jong-un literally executed the main conductor from an orchestra for 90 times.
Ah, my bad. He was executed 90 times. That's a pretty overboard death penalty. She didn't provide any reference for this account, but we did some research of our own and found this article, which lists a source of the story. A South Korean reporter called Ju Song-ha. The article notes that Song-ha's story has no independent verification and goes on to point out that he could not even name the supposedly executed conductor. These stories from the South Korean press, which Yeonmi and many others seem to get their news from, puzzle me a lot. Because they seem to put two opposite images of North Korea together and expect us to not question them while doing so. On one hand, we are told that North Korea is a country where no one can get in or out, where moving from even one town to the next is difficult, where international phone calls are impossible to make.
We called North Korea after we escaped.
And you can't talk to anyone without a secret policeman listening in on your every word. On the other hand, South Korean journalists come out with these stories about supposed current events in North Korea all the time. They must be getting their info from someone, right? How is it that the DPRK is a country totally cut off from the rest of the world, yet also a country where time and time again, people are able to reach out and give all the gritty details on the next horror story of the week to members of the media on the other side of the border? How is it that North Korea can be such an information black hole, yet be a journalist's wet dream at the same time? Of course, there is one explanation I can offer. The South Korean newspapers are making all of this shit up to get a quick buck off their readers. But that would be a bit too cynical to believe. Right? I personally don't think so. The fact of the matter is, none of the tales we hear so often about have been backed up with any hard evidence. Sensational horror stories often go unchallenged by most media outlets, no matter how wild they sound. If they later turn out to be from the most unreliable accounts imaginable, or the story is able to be proven wrong, then tough shit, the damage has already been done. Instead of being encouraged to think about the stories we hear from this country in a nuanced way, acknowledging both of the two sides that always appear on every coin, We are rather pressured into believing every word said without questioning its validity, since looking at these topics in any other way than the typical horror show narrative is painted as sympathizing with a government marred by allegations of abuses and totalitarianism. But can one really believe that 30,000 people were executed for one person's defection? That committing a crime in this country dooms 8 generations of your family, without at a bare minimum raising an eyebrow? Is it reasonable to uncritically believe that wide-ranging economic sanctions only affect the elite of the DPRK and have no part to play in its economic troubles or shortages? It turns out that Park Yeonmi likes to either not mention the sanctions at all or downplay the effect they have on the North Korean people. If the DPRK is poor, trade embargoes and sanctions have nothing to do with it. It's all down to the state, its leaders, and the dreaded ideology of communism. Speaking of communism, can you guess who hates commies more than anyone else? Die-hard, right-wing, conservative capitalists. I wonder what side of politics Yeonmi places herself on.
We're so brainwashed, I don't even know, but they say, look at us, we have homeless, that's great, you have freedom to even homeless. And they're like, look at us, we have inequality, amazing! How amazing is that?
Considering the fact that she was backed by the Freedom Factory and its partner, the Atlas Network, both libertarian think tanks which despise left-leaning governments, we might have found the reason why Yeonmi doesn't like to talk about sanctions or certain parts of North Korean history. These think tanks are no joke either. For instance, the Atlas Network has partially been blamed by some for the destabilization of Venezuela, which has faced violent protests over economic troubles and a battle for executive power between its government, headed by President Nicolas Maduro, and the opposition, headed by self-declared interim President Juan Guaido.
Thank you to the Atlas Network, to all freedom fighters and Democrats around the world for your support and inspiration.
Thank you, Atlas. Now, what is the problem with any sort of think tank sponsoring a shitload of people who make up stories or spew unverifiable claims to their YouTube audiences? Well, that sponsorship comes with a lot of concerning potential.
We work all around the world. We're based in the US. We have about 159 partners in the United States right now. And the bulk of our partners are outside, nearly 500 in total.
You could mobilize this crowd of people to campaign against an ideology, the opposing political wing, or in this case, an entire fucking country. The last thing hardcore capitalists and libertarians want to see is a striving leftist or left-leaning nation, so naturally, they might just propagandize their defector partners to mislead the public, strain international relations with that nation.
On Iran and North Korea, nuclear programs that present serious threats to American security and the security of the world.
And encourage more hardline policies against it from the capitalist world. The goal isn't just to end the conflict and make the two Koreas coexist. The stranglehold the DPRK was put in mostly resembles a conform or die attitude. The DPRK is expected to give up everything it built over some 80 years and embrace a way of life from the opposite side of the border.
While activism against certain political systems or a set of ideas isn't good or bad, and everyone will have differing opinions on issues of this kind, using unreliable storytellers and exaggerated stories in order to do so is fucked up. Now, since so much of what we hear about North Korea's history is skewed to one side of the argument, why don't we balance things out a little bit and offer up a side to this country's history you might not have heard before?
Hello, my name is Mark, foreign correspondent for Mega Past the Iron Curtain. I'm here to tell you that Mega, despite being free to view on YouTube, has been a project in which the creator with a stupidly long name and his British colleague with a not so long name put hundreds of hours into. 100% out of my own free will, I want to tell you. If you want to help finance future productions, you can do so by sending donations through PayPal, buying the Mega Bonus Content Pack on GUMROAD for a good price, yes? Or by committing to a subscription on Patreon or GUMROAD. The fat idiot with the name that is too long spent too much money on camera equipment, and instead of calling Kimmy G for a fat check to sponsor his propaganda, he has decided to go the route of the beggar. By the way, can you guess where I'm from? I bet you can't. Beggars can be choosers and musicians can't either. So if you don't want to give money to the fat guy, consider buying one of NanoRay's many albums. Or all of them. Buy once and all forever on Bandcamp. We recommend Tilt, Gacha, Spiral, and NanoRay's new album, Digimaiden. Yes? He allowed us to shamelessly confiscate his work for our beloved production. So he's worthy of shilling. By the way, your consumerism disgusts me. Since Mega is created by an idealist idiot, you might have noticed there are no advertisements interrupting the program. This is due to his absolute humble generosity and also maybe possibly the fact that the documentary is filled with vulgar expressions. The general horrors of war, and pictures of recently nuked husks, formerly known as people. Making this production impossible to be enjoyed by easily exploitable children of our beloved benefactor, Susan Wojcicki. This is why you are forced to listen to me, Mark, a guy with an ambiguous accent trying to sell you products from the fat beggar. Without further ado, feed the fat man. Keep Mega alive, and have fun with the rest of the dark.
Hurry, step right up, folks. Here's the answer to your problems. Dr. Utopia's sensational new discovery, ism. Ism will cure any ailment of the body politic. It's terrific, it's tremendous. And now then, because we are introducing this amazing item for the first time in this country, it isn't going to cost you 1 cent. All you have to do is sign this little scrap of paper, and you get your bottle absolutely free.
I hereby turn over to ISM Incorporated everything I have, including my freedom and the freedom of my children and my children's children, in return for which said ISM promises to take care of me forever.
Sign right here.
Why, this is ridiculous.
America really dislikes communism. And quite a few times that anti-communist ideology was a driving motivator to get involved in past conflicts. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Korea, ring any bells? In the case of Korea, we have to keep in mind that the freedom fighters back in the 1950s were the founders of North Korea. In the early 1900s, Korea was annexed by Japanese imperialists and remained in their grip until the end of World War II's Pacific Theater in 1945, when Koreans formed a new revolutionary government mixed between right-wing nationalists and left-wing socialists, as the Japanese withdrew. This new government carried out a program of land reform, redistributing property to workers and farmers. You might think this is something the right would normally be against and unwilling to cooperate with, and you'd be right. But in this case, Korean property at the time was overwhelmingly controlled by the Japanese and their cronies. In these conditions, you can understand why nationalistic righties would be happy to see these properties be taken into new hands. Unfortunately for the revolutionary Koreans, the big players of the war had other ideas and their government turned out to be short-lived. Midway through the year, 2 young American officers, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, picked up a National Geographic map and found a spot to split the country in half by in the wake of Japanese capitulation. After a short time, they settled on the 38th parallel, a line that the Japanese and pre-communist Russians had planned to split the country by decades earlier. At least, before the Japanese snatched everything for themselves. They reasoned that this line would give the 2 victorious blocs of the Second World War roughly equal portions of land on the Korean peninsula, but most importantly, would leave the capital city, Seoul, in US hands. They didn't consult any experts, any historians, or any Koreans on their choice, but nonetheless it became a line that has divided the nation for almost 80 years. The end result was that the country was split between the Americans, who embraced the Japanese and their collaborators and gave the revolutionaries the boot, sweeping colonial Japanese crimes under the rug, and later organizing elections that were, according to the CIA itself, boycotted by more or less every party that wasn't based on an extreme right-wing ideology and had very limited voting rights in order to form a Republic of Korea, or ROK, and the Soviets, who embraced the revolutionary system and molded it to work with their own, allowing it to carry out its original reform program and creating what eventually became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK. For the next 5 years, these two parts of the country began to develop on their own, under their own leaders. The Soviets chose to support Kim Il-sung, a well-known revolutionary who had been dubbed the Tiger by the Japanese for his insurgent activities, to lead the North. The Americans, on the other hand, backed Ri Shing-man, an exiled political independence activist for the South. The split Korean nation faced widespread violence and unrest as both sides drew up plans to invade each other, and the South faced multiple violent uprisings which were put down in equally violent reprisals by President Ri. No one was willing to tolerate a divided Korea, and neither side was willing to accept unification under the flag of their enemy. Tensions very quickly reached a boiling point. While the North is more or less unquestioningly seen as the aggressor in this conflict in the West for beginning an invasion into the South, it's worth mentioning the extra context that they only committed to doing so after a string of provocations from the South at the border, believing the time had come to effectively retaliate. The inevitable result was an all-out war that lasted from 1950 to 1953, where ROK, America, and their allies fought under the banner of the recently formed United Nations against the DPRK and its Chinese allies. They could get away with this thanks to a domination of the UN Security Council by the US and its allies. China was represented on the council at the time by the pro-US Republic of China based on the island of Taiwan, not the pro-DPRK People's Republic on the mainland. The USSR was having none of that shit, so they protested by abstaining from taking a vote. Now, keep in mind, the United Nations was founded in order to establish an international forum for all countries, but as we can see, it quickly became a tool for divisive Cold War power plays. Meanwhile, the Chinese fielded their troops under a force known as the People's Volunteer Army in order to avoid a scenario where their regular army, the People's Liberation Army, was in combat with American forces, which could have sparked an unwanted extension of the war beyond Korea's borders. Suddenly, the battle goes from China versus America to a band of volunteers versus the UN. Bullshit was fought with bullshit. Even now, many decades later, this smoke and mirrors direction is kept up. To this day, the US and allied forces in Korea go by the name of the UN Command, even though the UN itself has stated this military isn't under their control, but rather takes orders from the US military. This supposed international force has had a grand total of 2 commanders that were non-Americans out of a total of 39 after over 7 decades. For the sake of balance, it's also worth pointing out that the Chinese still seem to pretend that their supposed volunteer force was anything but their original army with a new name slapped on it for the sake of diplomacy. Another pretty obvious misdirection. And if that wasn't all misleading enough, the US claimed they never went to war in Korea at all, even as it was happening. Instead, they were just participating in a police action. A police action with an army fighting against another army for control of a territory. Nope, definitely not a war. This was to dodge a requirement that exists in the US where the Congress has to be consulted before going to war. If there's no war, there's no need to ask. Now, I'm no expert in the American way of policing, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought cops did things like patrol their local areas, give out traffic citations, investigate robberies, maybe in some extreme scenarios go after violent criminals, beat up black people from time to time, not go into foreign countries and dropping napalm over their villages.
The UN delegates offered a compromise. They would accept the communist proposed ceasefire along the present battle lines if all other problems could be ironed out within 30 days. If not, all bets were off. The war virtually stopped, except for the constant booming of artillery.
Despite the fact that throughout this war, Northern Korea ended up as one of the most bombed regions of the world, leaving behind cityscapes that could be confused with historical pictures of Hiroshima, and racking up an impressive body count of between 2 and 3 million people, 2/3 of which being civilian casualties, along with the fact that the post-war Southern Korea emerged to be the military junta and stayed that way until the end of the Cold War. The Western world is often told that they were the heroes and saviors in Korea in a victorious battle for freedom and democracy against tyranny. Ultimately, knowing what we know, it seems more like a brutal war for control between two world blocs that ended in a return to a tense status quo, leaving scars which still last today and affecting more than 70 million people. It's a conflict that goes by many names in the history books depending on which country you're from. But one of the most common in the US is the Forgotten War. Maybe this is why we often struggle to see why the DPRK has such a siege mentality, and why current tensions are seen by them as an extension of decades of hostility. To us, this conflict was a footnote. To them, it was their defining moment. One they will most likely never forget. A grand total of 2 cities changed hands when all was said and done, one from south to north and the other from north to south. While both sides claimed victory as they were able to preserve their political systems and achieve huge successes at different points in their campaigns. In terms of a formal end to the conflict, no, a peace agreement has never been signed. Only a ceasefire, which the DPRK, but not the ROK, chose to sign up to. Overall, since the war is technically still going on to this day, it's an issue that likely won't be settled for a very long time. The facts accommodate much less of a good versus evil narrative in this case. To sum all this up, after the Koreans were freed from the grip of Japan, America arrived and in many ways started copying the methods of their old occupiers, preserving their forces, protecting their collaborators, and occupying their old stomping grounds. And while the Soviet Union packed up and left the Korean peninsula less than a decade after they arrived, the Americans are still there, calling the shots, to this day. Are you starting to see why the DPRK might hold a grudge yet? Now we're offering a new perspective to the DPRK's birth. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, the crisis of the Arduous March from 3 decades ago, which has been used to shape so much about our viewpoint on the country today. Yeonmi's book, In Order to Live, claims North Korea's fucked economy was spawned from the Soviet Union revoking food imports, China refusing to keep subsidizing parts of the DPRK's economy, and finally, a heavy dose of communism bad. What is missing from this historical recap is the fact that at the end of the Cold War, just as Kim Il-sung was passing the position of leader onto his son, Kim Jong-il, more or less all of North Korea's trade partners, such as the German Democratic Republic, ceased to exist as countries or were forced through major economic upheavals, with their successor states like the Russian Federation and unified Germany having little interest in maintaining the trade ties that acted as the DPRK's export network and agreeing to take a harsh line against their former ally to appease the US. North Korea's economy went from having a well-integrated several decades strong support network of like-minded countries to fuck all in the blink of an eye. The DPRK attempted to foster an ideology of self-reliance, to combat or slow these losses,
But you can only be so self-reliant when you live in a mountainous country not at all suited to farming. To add to this pile of disasters, North Korea faced mass floods described as being of biblical proportions throughout the 1990s, destroying much of the farmable land the country was already struggling to muster, worsening an already poor food situation and causing major damage to the DPRK's power generation program, where hydroelectric dams act as a key energy source. A UN appeal from the mid-1990s described this flooding as unheard of and being of a magnitude that had not been recorded in the last 70 years. It estimated that the costs needed for UN agencies to help the country recover from these disasters totaled over $40 million. One key thing to remember here is that every UN effort to relieve the DPRK of this crisis, both at the time of the Arduous March and in the modern day, has been vastly underfunded. Governments are often scared off, intentionally or not, from participating in the UN effort by the policy against the DPRK spearheaded by the US, leaving agencies with budgets nowhere at all near the amount expected to be needed to handle the remaining struggles with malnutrition and a tragic crisis unresolved. As well as governments, NGOs are also continuously scared away from providing aid in the DPRK due to the sanctions that were imposed on the country. Here we can show you a case study which details this problem. It explains how the work of an NGO called the Ignis community has been sabotaged by the sanctions resolutions. Ignis needed to acquire appropriate US licenses to be able to help in the north, yet it took them 3 years to obtain those licenses. After that, they needed to file an exemption request from the UN Sanctions Committee, which can take up to a year to be completed. Ignis went through this bureaucratic nightmare and was able to eventually provide the DPRK with medical supplies, but sadly, not many other NGOs follow in their footsteps, and if they wanted to, the help would most definitely come far too late. A 2017 order from the US government banning its citizens from visiting or remaining in the DPRK has also exacerbated this problem. But of course, in Yeonmi's world, things are very different. In her mind, all of these factors do not matter at all. Instead, starvation and malnourishment is something deliberately concocted by the North Korean government. A modern-day holocaust that puts the DPRK on par with the Third Reich.
They've spent years and years and years developing this idea of socialism and independence. The last thing they want to do is expose to themselves, and especially to foreigners, that they've got problems. Yet they know they do, and they do want to help, and it's just a dilemma for them.
While flooding disasters of Arduous March proportions have not repeated since the 1990s, the country has still been a hotspot for major flooding as recent as last year. Yet somehow, we are expected to believe that this country intentionally sabotaged its own workforce through malnourishment, slamming productivity to a halt as a bid to hold onto power, and continues to do so. Does this claim at all match up with the facts?
You've got skin problems. These kids are stunted. There's a sort of a lethargy amongst some of those kids. It's not a situation that where they're dying instantly. It's deteriorating very steadily. So without some attention or without a nutritional support to these kids, you'll see them move into category 3 and into a critical state where they need to go to hospital.
Did Kim Jong-il sit down in his office and pray for these torrential downpours to destroy the fields, power stations, and homes? If we go by the UN report, we can see that mass flooding in the DPRK was so severe that not only did it destroy key infrastructure, it swept away entire villages and bridges, and reportedly even changed the course of entire rivers permanently. Was this all a man-made invention? The report also notes that much of the rehabilitation work has been undertaken by the DPRK itself. But the DPRK government is not in a position to fully overcome the effects of the floods on its own. Is this not true either?
What is the more likely scenario? The UN is gaslighting everyone into believing North Korea has been pulling its weight more than it really has?
Or a woman who hasn't even lived in the country since she was 13 just doesn't know what she's talking about. After this period of mass upheaval in the 1990s, the late 2000s brought varying layers of international sanctions on the DPRK, which tightened over time, eventually more or less banning the country from legally trading with the rest of the world and participating in international banking. While Yeonmi has this to say about sanctions.
Like, because of sanctions, North Korea cannot have any trades with other nations. And the sanctions doesn't affect like those daily life things. They affect the luxury goods that are going to Kim Jong-un and like affecting them to build more nukes. It's like really starving the regime.
A 48-page long analysis on the adverse effects would indicate another side of the story. Tragically titled, The Human Cost and Gendered Impact of Sanctions on North Korea, this analysis is filled with unfortunate observations which showcase the consequences sanctions have in vital sectors of the DPRK's infrastructure. We highly encourage you to download this analysis yourself on the koreapeacenow.org website. It details how the DPRK has been hit with a near total embargo by the UN Security Council under a recent policy of maximum pressure, disallowing the country from trading vital resources that it needs to keep its economy growing and its population fed and healthy. Somehow, in Yeonmi's mind, an embargo that bans North Korea from trading with any other country only harms Kim Jong-un and restricts the luxuries the higher ranks of the country receive, not the local population or their necessities in any way. Just think about that for a second. No permitted trade at all. None. Who is that more likely to harm? The leadership or ordinary people dealing with these issues throughout their day-to-day lives? What is more likely to be lost as a result of this? Luxury commodities or basic necessities?
I can't make good coffee. Good coffee's no problem if you use the coffee with better flavors. Folgers coffee? Yeah, Folgers is different. They blend it special. And Folgers is mountain-grown coffee. Mountain-grown? That's the richest kind. You try it.
If you're still not sure how much a change like this could shock a nation, just think about how many foreign-produced things you use every day. Maybe some of the food you eat, the car you drive, the phone, tablet, TV, PC, or console you're watching this video on. Imagine all these things are no longer for sale, and they'll never be back in stock. Remember, not too long ago, we had a worldwide shortage of masks during the corona pandemic. Even if you can imagine there being underground markets and off-the-books dealers bringing things into the country on a lower level, it's pretty easy to see that this will almost certainly have a huge impact on your lifestyle. Not just that of the president, prime minister, chancellor, king, queen, whatever other ruler you happen to live under. Now, get this. This is another quote directly from a study on page 11. The UN exemption approval timeframe is too short. It is valid for only 6 months, while the program cycle in the DPRK, securing resources, international procurement, production of the goods/medicines, quality testing, and transport and distribution for most program components, takes at least 9 to 12 months. So not only are the sanctions incredibly draconian, but they also make it systematically impossible for humanitarian exemption requests to be processed and approved. The tragic thing is that the UNSC already knows that sanctions have these side effects, yet is still allowing the system it has set up to interfere with humanitarian aid programs. Here's one last quote from the study to put things into perspective. It's a very interesting one. Paradoxically, the North Korean government is excluded from applying for humanitarian exemptions despite being most responsible for the well-being of its people. So while we constantly hear about how the DPRK's government does not provide for its people from international observers, here we can see that they are systematically speaking, intentionally blocked from doing so. Maybe it's just me, but I think if a Western, capitalist country lost all its trade partners in the space of a year or two, faced mass floods in the next decade, and then got progressively tangled up in greater and greater amounts of red tape from a global blockade in the decade after, it would be pretty fucked and near enough bankrupt as well. Yeah, Yeonmi, North Korean Holocaust, my ass. For me, this is an eerie reminder of a major event in my country's history, one of the early flashpoints of the Cold War, the Berlin blockade. From June 1948 to September 1949, the Soviet Union barred West Germans in Berlin from receiving food imports by blocking imports into the city via its railways, roads, and canals. The only limited exemption being several small air corridors connecting West Berlin, located deep within Soviet-occupied Germany, with US, British, and French-occupied Germany.
Next day, another surprise. The first English flying boat settles onto the Havel River.
Why? Due to the introduction of the German mark, a new independent currency for West Germany that the Soviets wanted to be stopped in order to keep Germany submissive and under the watchful eye of the Eastern Bloc. This humanitarian disaster was mitigated by constructing the Berliner Luftbrücke, which can literally be translated into English as the Berlin Air Bridge, which traveled along the limited Soviet-provided corridors. Great Britain and the United States transported goods to West Berlin by airplane to ensure that the civilian population was kept fed and healthy until the USSR realized their position was unsustainable and ended their blockade.
Why should 400 planes return empty every day? A 24-pfennig stamp becomes an airmail stamp, and letters reach the West in one day. Fast mail, a strange sidelight to Russian sanctions. Coal, to help get the Western sectors back into commission again. Every sack, a Western reminder that Soviet sanctions are intolerable.
In a sense, the DPRK could be said to have a similar bridge to feed its population, through the land rather than the air, at the Chinese border. But this is a rocky bridge, as China varies on the strength of its support for the North and its willingness to turn a blind eye to the sanctions resolutions. Also, while the Berlin blockade lasted just under a year before the Soviets gave in, the Korean blockade has lasted for 5 years and counting, and there are no signs of an end to the crisis from the Americans. You can imagine the damage on the North Korean people's well-being that has resulted from such a policy. Berliners were already left weary and desperate after going through a similar scenario that lasted 5 times less. The simple fact of the matter is that attempting to starve a civilian population into submission, especially outside of a combat scenario, like the scenes that took place in post-war Berlin, and the scenes that are taking place right now in modern Korea, is never a good or justifiable decision to make, and will often rally people of a target country against those making it. After all, advocating for a sweeping embargo just because you feel like it's worth screwing over a population of about 26 million is a sadistic position to assume.
Sanctions are intolerable.
The one silver lining of all of this is the fact that the Koreans of the DPRK are tough as nails. After enduring the Arduous March and repeatedly being shown the middle finger by the rest of the world, North Korea has proven time and time again that they do not let themselves be bullied into submission. Their independence is ever growing, and they also managed to up their food production significantly in recent times, showing that even during immense hardship, the international strategy of holding the Korean people's livelihoods in the balance in exchange for political concessions isn't a winning one. While the sanctions do make it increasingly more difficult for the North Koreans to strive, nothing ever seemed to be too insurmountable to survive, much as the Cubans discovered from facing an embargo of their own by their closest neighbors. Oh yeah, the US at it again. There will always be workarounds, which I totally support by only smoking Cuban. These people are no pushovers. Do not forget that.
Dum dum, diddle dum dum, diddle dum dum, diddle dum dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and cover, ducked and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do. You
and you
and you
and you, duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. This is an official civil defense film produced in cooperation with the Federal Civil Defense Administration.
After watching the first atomic test, Robert Oppenheimer, one of the inventors of the bomb, said,
I knew the world would not be the same. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu was trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Now, of course, supporters of the sanctions would justify them by saying that they were provoked by the DPRK's nuclear program and its habit of carrying out missile tests, and point out that all the DPRK has to do to see them lifted is to stop the tests and disarm their WMDs. But let's consider why the country has these weapons in the first place. Why does any country want to build a nuclear arsenal? It's the ultimate defense mechanism. Countries tend to not attack you if you have weapons capable of destroying them in a matter of minutes at your disposal. And of all countries, the DPRK is probably most in need of weapons of this kind if it wants to avoid invasion. As we already explained, the Cold War wiped most of the DPRK's allies off the map, depriving it of the collective security an alliance of supportive countries could provide. The country is on its own, surrounded by richer neighbors with better funded armies on all sides, one of which likes to practice invasions on its border every single year. In a situation like this, you can see why the country would see a weapon like the atomic bomb as the best method to keep its borders secure. On top of this, statistics indicate that out of all the nuclear-armed states, the DPRK actually has the least warheads with around 30 bombs. Of course, 30 bombs capable of wiping out entire cities or regions off the map sounds like a big problem, but to put that into perspective, China has around 300 warheads, while the US and Russia have over 6,000 each. Somehow, one small country arming itself with a supply of weapons eclipsed by everyone else is so unacceptable that it needs to be starved into capitulation. The US does missile tests of its own. It has a huge arsenal of its own. Do you think it would compromise and remove these weapons if demanded to by the international community? Would any other nuclear country? You can imagine the answer. Some would say that the reason the DPRK having nukes is an issue while others having them is not, comes down to how untrustworthy the country is with such a destructive weapon, because Kim Jong-un is a madman constantly hovering his finger over a red button. But let's ask ourselves, how many wars has the DPRK fought in? What about the US? How many nuclear bombs has the DPRK used against actual people, civilian populations, as opposed to the US? Which country seems more war or police action crazy when you put things into perspective? And to add to all of these factors, the supposedly nuclear crazy North has made deals on dismantling their WMD program multiple times, coming to the table with their mortal enemy to try and find a common ground. The last time they tried this approach was in 2018 and 2019, where Kim Jong-un met with Donald Trump and signed agreements pledging to denuclearization, envisioning a step-by-step approach. Some parts of the WMD program are dismantled, some sanctions are pulled back, going through bit by bit until there are no more nuclear weapons and in turn,
no more chains wrapped around the DPRK's economy. But the Americans had a very different idea of how things would go, as Trump eventually decided to demand that Kim hand all of his nuclear weapons over to the US in bulk if he wanted sanctions to go. And that killed off the negotiations, leaving the North to carry on with their program.
What's the big difference between an immediate deal and a step-by-step approach, you might wonder? Surely it produces the same end result. The DPRK should be happy anyway. It's simple. The issue is trust. With a step-by-step approach, both sides can build confidence in each other and see their agreements are being followed. One big deal straight away is filled with question marks for the DPRK. What if they handed over their bombs and the Americans chose to just not hold up their part of the bargain and kept the sanctions? The country would suddenly be decades behind in their defense program, much more vulnerable to attack, in exchange for nothing in return. If the North Koreans didn't hold up their end, the Americans could reimpose the sanctions with the stroke of a pen. The consequences for the Americans not following through are far greater for the North.
Deals like this falling apart are nothing new either. As early as the mid-1990s, the DPRK and the US came to the table with an arrangement. The two sides would normalize relations. The US would help build light water reactors in the country to compensate for the loss of power from denuclearization, and supply electricity and heating oil to the North until they were completed. In exchange, the DPRK would phase out its WMD program. The North Koreans began to follow this arrangement, shutting down their reactors and ending construction projects on newer ones. But the Americans delivered their oil infrequently and late, and never provided funding for the water reactors. As for normalizing relations,
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Yeah, didn't go so well.
So the deal collapsed and North Korea went back to its WMD development. As we can see, twice, the supposedly nuke-crazy country has signed deals to dismantle its program, and both times it has fallen through. Not because of the DPRK, but because of the people on the other side of the table that were supposed to be its partners. Suddenly, this whole issue is looking much less like a problem the DPRK has imposed on itself, and more like it's an issue created by outside pressure, nuclear-armed countries berating the North for playing them at their own game. The whole story reeks of an old lesson. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Yeonmi conveniently forgetting to mention the brutal embargo, and then when she does remember to talk about it, saying that the sanctions do not affect the general public but only the elite, shows how little the self-entitled voice of North Korea actually knows about the problems of her people that they have to endure. Journalistic masterpieces like Cannibalism is resurging, and I know because I watched a scary film, or Kim Jong-un is creating a real-life Squid Game in the country because military parades exist, only makes a mockery of the DPRK without offering potential resolutions to some of the many problems the Koreans of the DPRK have to endure. If Park Yeonmi has the best interests of her people in mind, she should be raising awareness of the embargo, which is one of the main reasons why the poorest of the Korean people are starved and sickly. How can one expect of a country to further industrialize and produce necessities when that country is disallowed from purchasing fuels and any item that contains metals? The reality is that the DPRK wants to trade, but if no one is able or willing to help or exchange goods, there are no more options left but to sit patiently by and wait. Now, you might say, it does not matter if Yeonmi lied about some things, she still endured a terrible existence in North Korea and spreads awareness. And there is no doubt that growing up in such a time of hardship must have taken a toll on her, and the other North Koreans who chose to leave their home country. But in the end, we have to ask ourselves, Where does this awareness lead us if it is presented in the form of skewed, misleading activism? Tales peppered with exaggeration, both of how bad the North is and how great the South is, have massively warped public perception on the two Koreas and those who choose to cross its borders. A messy, inaccurate picture. Something foreign media sources often choose to omit is the fact that North Koreans are a neglected minority in South Korea, at many times pushed to confess to be spies, forbidden to ever travel back home if they so wished, and severely disadvantaged in the job market, as it is not an uncommon phenomenon for the South's population to see the Northerners as outright enemies or second-class citizens. This kind of treatment and lacking opportunity helps us understand why the phenomenon of the celebrity defector has become so widespread in the last few decades of mass media. Let's say you're a poor North Korean refugee with little in the way of future prospects. One day a journalist knocks on your door and asks you to talk about your arduous journey to the South. They might nudge you to exaggerate or provide you with words to say to make sure your story has the impact the editors want to get across.
There's a young teenage boy, I think, lying down and his intestines coming out of his back. When you're really malnourished, that thing all opens up. You got zero fat. Every hole all opens.
With rewards online for creating something newsworthy and following the script. Once you get used to the pattern of crowd-pleasing and finally climbing out of a life of poverty you thought you'd be stuck with for good, you realize you've fallen into a rabbit hole without much in the way of an exit. This is only speculation, but maybe this is how the celebrity defector Park Yeonmi was created. The question I pose myself is how the DPRK is treated just? While most defectors, even those who massively exaggerate their accounts, likely do what they do to get by in an alienating society and don't hold malicious intents, the reality is that their words are twisted and used as products of hate, used to create a cartoonish, villainous image of the North that only feeds the perception we have of the country as an enemy, to be at best contained and at worst destroyed. Not only is this a problem because it obscures the truth and doesn't show journalistic integrity, but more than that, it's a problem because the portrayal has a real-world impact on roughly 26 million lives. In some cases, defector accounts have been seen to directly influence policymakers into further tightening the noose around the DPRK. The ultimate impact of this web of lies, revised stories, and contradicting narratives is that many anecdotes are overblown or just plain idiotic, turning out to rely solely on unprovable word of mouth. Tragically, I must admit that the trust I have had for defectors has been permanently tainted. What is a fabrication and what pertains to reality? The lines have been massively blurred, and the seeming willingness of journalists to accept the state of affairs has only deepened this distrust. Be honest. Before you were confronted with this information, did you think everything you heard about North Korea was true? That the country was always responsible for its own hardship? That the Kim dynasty wanted to starve its own people and wipe out its neighbors with nukes? Well, so did I, until I got the chance to look at the other side of a coin. By the way, no one can be blamed for believing this narrative. It is a mindset spread far and wide with little in the way of competing messages to challenge it. And while this messaging of demonization against the DPRK carries on without an effective counter-argument, politicians can still justify harsher and harsher actions against its people, barricading this country in, keeping it cut off from the outside, unable to trade, to keep much of its infrastructure running, or offer its people a sense of normalcy in their lives. This kind of situation will carry on until either we challenge the messaging or the country collapses. Maybe some think that all this is worth it, but ultimately we have to ask ourselves, do the people of this country deserve to be starved out because of the system they live under, or the decisions of their leaders, punishing some 26 million for the decisions of a few? Is adding to their problems through embargoes and threats going to make their lives better in the long run or not? Is it going to create the conditions for peace, or is it going to encourage a further butting of heads and more explosive conflict. The fate of a people living in the Hermit Kingdom mostly lies on its perception the world has on them, as international pressure could weaken or strengthen the strangleholds foreign governments hold on the DPRK. And right now, in part thanks to the phenomenon of celebrity defectors, the country does not stand in a good light.
I did lie, but in my book, I did say everything that was true. And after my book that came out in 2015 and September, not even one single people accuse the book because I'm gonna sue them now if they do it.
Yeonmi, if you decide to sue me, you have to realize that you would fuck us both, not just me. I don't have any money, and no company is backing me, so a lawsuit would absolutely ruin me. You, on the other hand, have a reputation to uphold. You advocate for free speech, and I am in no way inhibiting your right to free speech. Nor am I smearing you. All I did was bring up inconsistencies, which are backed with research and actual sources. Shit you said in the past. If you really think suing your critics is a good idea, then I guess you are able to do so. Just keep in mind, if you follow through, you will not stand in a good light. With that all being said and done, thank you for watching Mega.
Bye.